Hi, this is Chris again with Learn WebLogic Online, and in this lesson we're going to talk about application deployment. So what can be deployed within WebLogic? Well, WebLogic supports the Java EE6 standard specification for application development and packaging. And so what that means is that you can deploy any JEE application or module to WebLogic. Enterprise applications as ears, web applications as WAR files, EJBs as jars, and resource adapter archives as RARs, web services, Java EE libraries or shared libraries, and standalone JDBC and JMS modules. And there's also the WebLogic diagnostic framework, which can be deployed as a module as well, and that's in the form of a standard WAR format. So what is a deployment? Deployment is a packaged application or module, and we can target them or deploy them to one or more servers or a cluster. And the same tools that we use to deploy these applications, we can also use to manage their life cycle. So we can perform in-place upgrades, production redeployment, we can delete or disable or take offline an application and upgrade it with a new one, or we can deploy it in various states such as an admin state. So deploying an application in an admin state allows you to test out an application in a production environment prior to making it public to your end customer. So this works out very well when you're doing an in-place production upgrade where you've got a live application that your customers are constantly accessing and you're upgrading that application. So when you deploy that upgrade, you can have both applications available side by side concurrently. However, the upgraded application is in an admin state, which allows QA to log in and verify that the application is working in that environment. And once it's been checked out, they can promote the upgraded application. And WebLogic will promote the application to new production so the customers can access it. It will retire the old application. And all this can be done with zero downtime, and your customers will never know. So applications can be deployed in two different formats. The first format is the most typical format that you'll see, and it's an archive file. So earlier I mentioned a variety of different archive formats, EAR files, WAR files, RARs, and jars. Those are an archive file that is deployed to WebLogic. The archive file is usually generated during a formal CM build process. Developers write their code, they write the Java class files, and as part of some build process, say using Ant or Hudson or Maven to manage that build process, an archive file will be produced. And it's that archive file that will be deployed to WebLogic. Think of the archive file in terms as like an executable. If you're familiar with writing traditional compiled code, like C or C++ or pick your favorite compiler language, you end up building an executable. Well, with an executable, if you want to make a change, you've got to go back to the code, make the code change, and go through the build process again to produce an archive file. In Java, similar, right? I mean, Java is compiled bytecode. If you want to make a change to a class file, you do have to make a change to the code. However, in addition to Java class files in an archive file can contain any other file type. It can contain, if it's a web application, it will have images. It may have HTML. It will certainly have JavaScript or could have JavaScript. So these flat files aren't necessarily code. They're not compiled. They're just plain text files. There can be XML as well. Let's not forget that. So these text files aren't compiled, yet they're included in the archive file. So if we want to make a change to any one of these files, we have to make the change in the file and rebuild the archive file. And the reason why I'm going over this particular bit, because the other format is an exploded archive directory. So imagine, if you will, this jar file, which is similar to a zip file in a way. Yet a jar file or an EAR or WAR define a standard directory format. The compression algorithm that's used is similar to zip. So think of an exploded archive directory as an unarchived zip file with a standardized directory structure. So I can actually deploy an exploded archive directory to WebLogic. And one of the benefits of doing that is that if you have static files in your archive and you need to make frequent changes to them, then an exploded archive directory allows you to make that change without redeploying the application, without rebuilding an archive file. So when I've got an exploded archive directory that's deployed to WebLogic and I make that change is reflected almost immediately within WebLogic. Zero downtime, no need to take the application offline or to redeploy it. Another feature of an exploded archive directory is that if you have an application that requires direct file system access, let's say there are property files on the file system that you need to read and edit, and you need direct file system access, an exploded archive directory allows you to have direct access to the file system, whereas an archive file sits on the JVM's class path and it does not have access to the file system. That is strictly prohibited. That is not a design flaw, it's a design feature. That is part of the Java EE specification. So personally, I think you should only ever use archive files for your deployment. I mean, if you're an administrator, you probably don't have much control over what gets deployed or how it gets deployed. If you're handed an exploded archive directory, you could create your own archive file from that, but that really isn't your job as an administrator. And the reason why I prefer archive files over exploded archive files is that I believe that if you're going to be making changes to an application, then those changes should go through a formal change control process. If you're using WebLogic, you're not some startup company with a very lightweight application, some Web 2 application looking to disrupt, whatever industry that you're in. Typically, WebLogic is used for enterprise applications, large-scale applications, and with an exploded archive directory, if you're making modifications to the application directly in a production environment, you run the risk of fouling something up, and you could end up with an incident where you're suffering from downtime. So with an archive file, think of the archive file as read-only in that sense, and any changes to that archive file will have to go through a change control process. And so you make a code change or you make a file change and you rebuild that jar file or WAR file, and you move that through your various development environments and QA, staging and production, and so on and so forth. So personally, for me, an archive file is the safer way to go, especially if you're working in a production environment. Now, if you're in a development environment, by all means, use an exploded archive file and do your rapid development, rapid prototyping with that exploded archive directory. You'll save time. So there are 3 tools that you can use to deploy WebLogic. There's WebLogic Deployer, which is a command line Java class that you can use to deploy applications. So this can be included in you can write your own scripts and include the WebLogic.deployer to deploy applications. It's a single command that takes many different parameters, and I'll show you that in a second. And then there's the admin console. So like everything else in the world within WebLogic, you can use admin console to deploy an application. And then there's WebLogic scripting tool, which is, if I've mentioned this before, it's WebLogic's scripting language. It's built on top of Python or Python on Java. So for WebLogic.deployer, this is a Java class that lives in the WebLogic.jar file. And if you run the set WebLogic environment script or the set domain env environment script, if you source that, then your class path will be set in order to run WebLogic.deployer. You identify the URL for the admin server. You specify the username and password of the admin account for that server. And then you specify the location of the archive file or directory that you're going to deploy. Now, this is the bare minimum for deploying an application. This syntax deploys this myapp.ear application to the admin server that's running on port 7001. There are far more parameters for WebLogic.deployer. You can deploy an application using a deployment plan. So a deployment plan is a document that allows you to parameterize environment-specific settings for an application, and I'll go over that in the production deployment lesson later on. You can also target an application to a managed server or servers or a cluster. So you don't see that reflected here in this syntax, but we'll go over that in the lab. So the admin console is the other method, and this is probably the more common and familiar method for most folks. A series of web screens, UI screens that allow you to deploy an application and define various parameters around how that application is deployed. You can also use the admin console to manage and monitor its deployment status. So I can start up and shut down an application. I can take it offline or pause it. I can take a look at its performance and its health. So we can take a look at all the servlets, how much memory it's using, how many requests it's handling. We can see its thread performance, and there's many others as well. So we can monitor this application through the console. And then there's WebLogic scripting tool, or WLST. So you can write a WLST script, which is a .py file, Python, or you can launch WLST interactively and issue the command that you see here on your screen. So to deploy an application to WebLogic, there's a single WebLogic command, or WLST command, called deploy, and it takes a handful of parameters. So I haven't gone over WebLogic scripting tool in depth yet. There is a separate lesson on that. But the prerequisite here is that when you launch WebLogic scripting tool, you connect to a WebLogic domain. You connect to an admin server that's already running. And then you run the deploy command to deploy an application. So the beauty with WebLogic scripting tool is that you can embed it in Python scripts. You can have a standalone WebLogic script, or you can embed this in a Python script or a Jython script. And so you can be very fancy with your deployment scripts. Perhaps you have a script that starts up a WebLogic server and deploys an app. You can roll that entire process into one script. And you've got the power of Python and its language functions, and you've got the power of WebLogic scripting tool with its specific functions. So in the course on WebLogic scripting tool, we'll go over how we can create a domain and deploy resources to it. So it's very powerful. So WebLogic has this notion of deployment modes, and a deployment mode determines how deployment files are made available to the target servers that deploy the application. And so a target is typically a managed server or servers or a cluster. So there are three types of modes. The first mode, and this is the most common mode, is the staging mode. So in staging mode, when I'm deploying an application to a server, servers, or a cluster, that archive is copied, or exploded directory is copied to the target servers. So each server gets a copy of the application. This is the default staging mode for WebLogic, and it's typically used for small to medium-sized applications. Now you can use it for large applications, but you run into a lot of network overhead and performance issues if you have to redeploy a very large application over the wire to other servers, many other servers. You could have a very large WebLogic cluster with 8, 10, 12 servers in it, and if you're deploying an application that's several hundred megabytes, you're going to feel that pain. So the other method is the no-stage method. So files are not copied to the target servers. Instead, the files are staged prior to deployment, and the target servers deploy using the same physical copy of those deployment files. So typically, the most common example I see of this is that you have a WebLogic cluster and you have a large application and you want to deploy it to the cluster that has several WebLogic managed servers in it. Typically, I see an NFS share or a share drive created where the application is staged, and that share is mounted on all the WebLogic servers in the cluster. And so when you deploy an application using no stage mode, you specify the location of the application that sits on the NFS share. And so the applications will deploy using that copy. Whereas in stage mode, you deploy an application from the admin server, and the admin server copies those files to each of the target servers, and each target server has its own copy of the application. In no stage mode, the target servers use the same physical copy of the application. And the third deployment mode, which is the least common deployment mode, is external stage. So when you deploy an application using external stage, application files are not copied like no stage mode. This is typically used when you've got an external process copies files from one source location to the target location. It's similar to no stage. However, WebLogic has a hand in managing applications that are deployed using no stage, whereas in external stage, it's entirely up to you or the administrator or some third-party process to manage those deployment files, so the target servers have access to them. So this could be a Chef script, this could be some Hudson Automation or Maven or what have you, but some process that can push the files out to a staging area. So that's application deployment in a nutshell. There's not a whole lot. Application deployment is fairly simple on the surface. You have an application and you identify where you want it to run, and you deploy it using one of the 3 methods I mentioned earlier. So let's jump over to lab number 7 on application deployment, where we'll exercise and practice some of the techniques that I've mentioned in this lesson.